Well, hi, welcome to the Christian Contrast, where we talk about how walking with Jesus leads us to live differently than those in the world around us. And actually, that little tagline that I say at the beginning of every podcast episode that we record feels especially appropriate for this episode. Going to be talking about living as exiles. So just so you know, here's where we stand. Right now, it's a few days before the election. By the time we post this, it'll probably be a day or two after the election. I don't know how much everything will be settled with president and with other races by then. But I wanted to record this, and this has broader implications of how we live as Christians, but especially in light of whenever we face an election, and a presidential election always feels bigger than a midterm election. And so whenever we're dealing with these things, I think it's valuable for us as Christians to try to place this in its proper context. And the reason why I'm using the word exiles, sort of principles for us as Christians living as exiles, is because that is one of the New Testament images for how we view ourselves as Christians. Peter talks about this in the introduction to his first letter, the letter of 1 Peter. He says, "To God's elect exiles scattered throughout the provinces," and then he names a whole bunch of places that they are. Exiles scattered throughout. James, while he doesn't use the word exiles, he paints kind of a similar picture when he introduces his letter. And he says, "To the 12 tribes scattered among the nations." And it's possible that James's letter was more specifically to Jewish believers, but probably in a broader sense, it was just to believers. And he pictures them as the 12 tribes scattered. Now, in both cases, with both Peter and James, here's what seems to be the imagery they're drawing on. In the Old Testament, the nation of Israel, most of the Israelites were taken into exile. Now, there were different times throughout their history that Israel was an occupied nation and they dealt with different occupiers, whether it was the Midianites or the Philistines. The book of Judges walks through all those sorts of things. But later on, in the time of the kings, the northern kingdom of Israel was taken into exile to Assyria, and the southern kingdom of Judah was taken into exile in Babylon. And so most of the Israelites were actually removed from their homeland and were then in a foreign land. They were exiles. They were in a place that was their new home, but wasn't their real home, and they were longing to get back to their real home. And New Testament authors then, sometimes very overtly, sometimes more subtly, paint the picture that that's one of the ways that we can view ourselves as believers. Maybe that's part of why Paul emphasizes in Philippians 3 the whole idea of our citizenship being in heaven. Maybe that's part of why John talks about the whole idea of not loving this world. That there's the imagery, there's the idea that, all right, we're here, and there's a sense in which this is our home, but we view it as our temporary home. We view our true citizenship in heaven. We view our final home as not simply where we go when we die, but in the idea that Jesus will return and retake the earth, and that we will end up dwelling with him here forever. So we're living in a home, but we're not finally home. So how do we do that? How do we live as exiles, especially when we're going through a season of time in our country where it's very tempting to be all wrapped up in questions about the future of our nation and the state of our nation. And what is our nation going to look like under a Harris presidency? Or what is our nation going to look like under a second term of a Trump presidency? How is all this going to work out? What's going to happen if the Democrats are in charge? What's going to happen if the Republicans are in charge? Or maybe for some of you, you have concerns that are a bit more local to the state of California, or if you're listening to this from somewhere else. But we have all these things wrapped up in this question. So what I want to do is, and I'm going to walk through some passages as we do this, I'm going to talk about 4 things that we do as exiles that reflect us embracing that identity. That this is our home. If we're in the U.S. or in California, get more local if you want to. That there's a sense in which this is our home, but it's not our final home. We're exiles. So principle number 1 of how we live as exiles is that we look to bless our temporary home. Now, for the other 3 principles I'm going to talk about, I'm going to go through New Testament passages. But for this one, I want to bring up an Old Testament passage because I think it's beautiful in the way that it paints the picture for Israel while they're in exile, how they're meant to behave. I think it says something to us about God's heart for any of us who find ourselves in exile. So this is from Jeremiah 29. This is verses 4 through 7. It says, "This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon." And just as a quick pause on that, you notice God is the active agent. He doesn't say, hey, you just found yourselves in these situations, or Babylon was really strong. He says, I did this. I carried you off. I made this choice. You are there on purpose. And again, I think there's something we can take there where we can say for Californians, for believers in California, we can feel like very unsettled sometimes. But just to say, for at least this time and place, God has placed us here. There are no accidents. Acts 17 talks about the idea that all of us came from, all nations came from one man, and that God chooses our times and our places and our seasons. There's a great amount of comfort that we can take in the sovereignty of God. So he says, this is what I say to the exiles: build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. Now, as a quick note on this, almost with 100% certainty, what God is saying to the people here is not, hey, you're in Babylon, just do as the Babylonians do. Just hey, marry your sons off to Babylonian women, marry your daughters off to Babylonian men. He almost certainly is not saying that. What he is saying here is continue to live in hope. Don't act as if it's all over now. Continue to have your sons marry almost certainly Jewish women, and your daughters marry Jewish men. Continue to increase in number. Don't treat this as if it's the end. One of the things that drives me crazy is when people talk about the idea of like, I just don't know if it's moral to bring a child into this world. I think that this is God's answer to this. Having children is an act of hope. We don't give up on the world, even if we're in exile. And then he closes the passage in verse 7 by saying, also seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. Pray for the peace. Pray for the striving. There's this really interesting attitude that God prescribes for the Israelites in exile. I think it carries over into us today. It's easy for us to feel like we are against sort of the place that we are in exile, that it's us versus them, that we're the cloistered Christians, or where the Christians try to figure things out, and then there's this whole world of people that we're against. Our true enemy is not flesh and blood. We know that from the scriptures. Our true enemy is the devil. But it's easy to start seeing the culture around us as the enemy. And it's understandable because the culture around us is not in line with what God would have us do. There's lots of sort of, there's asymmetry between what God wants us to do and what the world wants us to do. And that certainly was true of the Israelites in Babylon. There's a lot that they could have looked at. And if God wanted to, he could have said, hey, just look around and identify all the things that are wrong with this place. And it would not have been difficult. They could have found all kinds of idolatry. They could have found all sorts of immorality, probably social norms that were very unhealthy. It would have been easy to identify all those things. It's easy for us to do that in the United States. It's probably even easier for us to do that in California, to look around and be like, all right, the normalization of sort of, these weird gender identity stuff, the idea that there's so much divorce, the idea that there's so much sexual immorality, the idea that we've legalized marijuana and just sort of normalized drug use, all these sorts of things. We could look at lots and lots of things, and it's easy to identify. And it's not that we're meant to turn a blind eye to that, but we are meant to be for the place that we are. Instead of being antagonistic, we're meant to pray for the peace and the prosperity of the place that we are, and we're meant to be a positive influence. We're meant to be a blessing to our temporary home. So part of how we live as exiles is that even though we say, all right, the United States or California or the Inland Empire or Upland, Rancho Cucamonga, Fontana, Laverne, wherever you are, where I am is not my final home. This is where God has placed me right now. And as an exile, I want to be a blessing to where I am. I don't want to be somebody who is perceived or in reality as being against the area that God has placed me. I want to be a positive agent for peace wherever God has placed me. So number one, as exiles, we look to bless the temporary home that we have. And the main way he talks about doing that is through prayer. So just a question. Wherever you're at with the election or just with where our country is at, with where our state's at, are you regularly praying for the peace and prosperity, for justice and for wisdom to prevail where God has placed us? That's how we live as exiles. So number one, we look to bless our temporary home. Number two, we look not to get too attached. There's a lot of passages I could have chosen for this one, but I chose Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, which is most especially about money, but I think you'll see a broader application here. These are the words of the Lord Jesus, where he says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where moths and vermin do not destroy, and where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." This is similar in many ways to what John writes in the famous passage in 1 John 2, verses 15 through 17 about not loving the world. And so when he talks about the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, the pride of life, what he says is these things are passing away. It's not simply that they're morally wrong. They are morally bad, but it's that they're passing away. And Jesus says here, he doesn't just say, be generous and be kingdom-oriented with your money because it's the right thing to do. He says, store up treasures in heaven because nobody can take those away from you. And any treasure that you have in earth is something that will be taken away from you. It's really significant for us to recognize that, not just when it comes to money and not just when it comes to possessions, but to look around at the different things that are important to the culture around us and say, there's so many things that we can get caught up in, and they're temporary. Now, there are meals that we have and vacations that we take and things that we do that are temporary, but they're still the normal joys of life. They're sort of in line with Ecclesiastes, where we're humble enough to enjoy the simple things of life and enjoy them for what they are, as good gifts from God. So it's not saying don't have a good meal, don't have good friends, don't have hobbies. It's not saying any of that. But it's saying don't make your focus things that are temporary. Whether that's possessions, whether that's money, whether that's retirement, whether that has something to do with political power or influence or getting bent out of shape about what's happening in a particular time or election. We're not shrugging. We're here for the peace and the good of our area, but we're not so caught up in the sense that we're viewing our treasures here on earth as our final treasures. We're not getting too attached because we know this isn't our final home. And we know the things that we have right now, we're not taking with us. So if we're going to live as exiles, again, think of the Israelites being there in exile. Maybe they have made a home and they want it to be a home that's good to live in and that has a good rapport and that looks good. But all the while, what they're thinking when they're in exile is, we can't wait till we get back to Israel. We can't wait till we're released from this exile, which in Babylon they were after 70 years. We can't wait to get back home. And so if you're thinking that way, you don't want to set up your home in a way that it's going to be hard for you to leave. You don't want to set up that when you're finally given the freedom to go back to Israel, you're like, oh, I'm kind of bummed. I spent all my time, all my money, all my emotional effort on this home, and now I've got to leave it behind. We know we're going to leave the things in this world behind. So we don't get too attached. In a sense, we settle in and we look to be a blessing. In another sense, we act as if we're always ready to go. As if Jesus, if he was coming back today, we wouldn't say, oh, shoot, I've got a lot of things that are important to me. I wish you would wait. We would be absolutely ready on that day that he returns. So we look to bless our temporary home. We don't get too attached. Number 3, how we live as exiles, is that we embrace standing out. This is hard because most of us want to blend in or fit in. Sometimes some of us do want to stand out, maybe not always for godly reasons. But for a lot of us, we don't want to stand out. We want to fit in. First Peter, if you're looking for a New Testament book that really champions this idea of living like exiles, I don't think any book does it better than 1 Peter. 1 Peter chapter 2, verses 11 and 12, Peter says, Dear friends, I urge you, as foreigners and exiles, continuing that theme, to abstain from sinful desires which wage war against your soul. Live such good lives among the pagans that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day he visits us. Live such good lives that they stand out. That even though people try to slander you or try to say you're not doing good, they're going to be embarrassed because you're clearly doing so much good for the city. And when he talks about the idea of abstaining from sinful desires which wage war against the soul, if you do this, you're going to stand out as an exile. The Jews, when they were in Babylon, there were certain ways that they worked within the Babylonian culture, but there were other ways that they stood out. I mean, if they were keeping kosher, they stood out. If they were still practicing Sabbath, they stood out. If they were still abstaining from certain things or celebrating certain holidays while they were away, celebrating the Sabbath and the Passover and things like that, they stood out. And they were not afraid to stand out because when they stood out, they were pointing toward the idea that they had a greater allegiance than to Babylon, and they had a greater home than Babylon. We live lives that are meant to stand out. And if I could just say a minute, if anybody's listening to this who's sort of like college age or younger, and I get that this is really hard. When you're in junior high or high school or college, man, it's really hard when you're the one who stands out. You just want to sort of be part of the group. And this doesn't mean that in every instance you're supposed to alienate yourself from others. You want to be a blessing to the school that you're at. You want to be a blessing to the friends that you're around and the teachers that you're around and the community that you're in. But you got to embrace the idea that you're going to stand out. You're in exile. Your true citizenship is in heaven. Your true father is God. Your true community is the church. We stand out, and we're going to live lives that are different, which means there are certain things that a lot of other people are doing that we're not going to do. And there are other things that other people don't feel any obligation to do that we are going to do. And so whether that has to do with money and the idea that we're generous with our money when other people are hoarding it, whether it has to do with the idea that we're saving sex for marriage when that's no longer normal in the culture around us, whether it has to do with the ways that we're talking to others and that we're really trying to understand people who are approaching life differently than us instead of just talking badly about them, we're going to stand out, and we want to embrace the idea that we're standing out. In 2 Corinthians 5, Paul talks about the idea. He refers to himself and the apostles, but I think there's a broader application of this. He says, we are Christ's ambassadors. And the idea of an ambassador is that the ambassador is in a foreign land representing his home country and sort of his home king, or the one who sent him. That's what we are in the world. We are ambassadors. And if we're ambassadors, then we have a greater obligation and a greater loyalty to representing the one who sent us into exile here than the people around us who want us to just acclimate to the norms. We embrace the idea of standing out. We do not want to send the message to people that Christians are just like everyone else. We want to send the message Christians are different than everyone else. We're not trying to be obnoxiously different, but we are different, and we're inviting you into something that's better than what you're experiencing right now. So as exiles, we look to bless our temporary home. We don't get too attached to the things and the realities around us. We embrace the idea of standing out. And finally, number 4, we long for our home. I want to read one of the most meaningful passages to me in the whole Bible. This is Hebrews 11, verses 13 through 16. And so this is a small interruption in the train of Hebrews 11 when the author keeps talking about different men and women who walked by faith. He has a little interruption to say this. He says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance, admitting that they were foreigners and strangers on the earth. Another word for foreigners and strangers would be exiles. It then says, people who say such things show that they are looking for a country of their own. If they had been thinking of the country they had left, they would have had opportunity to return. Instead, they were longing for a better country, a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. We long for our final home. And we show that we long for our final home by living in a way where we're okay with everybody knowing this is not our final home. We've learned to accept the idea that we don't completely fit in, and sometimes that's going to make people annoyed with us, or make people make fun of us, or make people disregard us. We're okay with that because we know we have a final home. We're okay with taking courageous steps. We just finished our last, it's not summer anymore, but our last 2024 Go team, where our global outreach teams go out to different parts domestically and all over the world. And it's such a powerful thing in a temporary way to go and to leave behind comfort in order to reflect Jesus in far off places. And we want more and more people at our church praying through and thinking through, is God calling me in a more long-term way to go overseas? And that's a hard thing. And it's a hard thing because it involves us leaving behind the familiar and leaving behind our homes. But you know what makes it easier for us to do? When we realize this isn't our final home. You're not leaving behind your ultimate home. You're leaving one area where you're in exile to go to another area where you're going to be in exile. Now, if you're a United States citizen and you go to Kenya, you will probably feel more like an exile there. You'll feel more like a foreigner there, but we're exiles in both places. And when we live as if we're longing for our eternal home, it becomes easier to live with courage, to live with conviction, to live with integrity, and to live with consistency. How much time, honest question, how much time do you sit daydreaming about how amazing it's going to be when Jesus returns and sets up his kingdom on the earth? I mean, do you think about that? Revelation 21, the idea that there's no more curse, there's no more death. He's wiped tears away from our eyes. Do you spend time just reflecting on, daydreaming about how wonderful it's going to be? Maybe in the way that when you're engaged to be married, you're daydreaming about how great it's going to be married. Do you daydream about your eternal home? Or are you so focused on the very temporary things going on right now that's crowded out of your mind and of your heart? Exiles don't cloister themselves. Exiles look to bless their temporary home. And if we're exiles, we also don't get too attached because we recognize the things that we have here are temporary. As exiles also, we look to embrace the idea that we'll stand out in the culture around us. And as exiles, we long for our final home, for our eternal home. And that gives us the courage to continue to live the way that God has called us to live. I think this is an important message for us at all times, but especially at a time like this, where we can be very, very tempted to be either disproportionately elated because something in the election went our way and now we think everything's going to be great, or disproportionately discouraged because something in the election did not go our way and now we think that it's doom and gloom. We think that all things are over. Being kind of happy or being kind of bummed is fully appropriate. There are some outcomes that are better than others in any election. But being devastated or being elated, there's a degree to which it doesn't fit with the fact that we're exiles and we see this as our temporary home. We're looking to be a blessing here, but we have a different home. And as wonderful as we could look to make things here, we're ultimately inviting people to be exiles like us and longing for that eternal home. If you have thoughts or comments on what you've heard today, I'd invite you can go ahead and leave a comment on our YouTube video. We put all the videos of the Christian Contrast on our YouTube channel for Life Bible Fellowship Church. And also we have all our episodes on our website for lbf.church, along with the fact that if you go to lbf.church, you get to know all kinds of things about our church. If you're somebody who's not a part of our church and you're looking to explore what we're all about, as we as Life Bible Fellowship Church look to passionately pursue life in Jesus and to lead our neighbors to do the same. We come out with episodes of the Christian Contrast every 2 weeks, and so we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode. And that also means that if you found this content and you found it encouraging or helpful, we've got all kinds of episodes that you could go back to and you could look through and sort of by topic find something that you're interested in listening to. So until 2 weeks from now, thanks so much for taking the time to listen. God bless you, and thank you for listening to the Christian Contrast.